Odysseus spent 10 years winning a war and another 10 trying to come back from it. He defeated armies, monsters, witches, and even escaped the land of the dead. But he could not escape the consequences of his own pride. Take the Cyclops. Odysseus had already won. The giant was blind, the cave was behind him, and his surviving men were safely escaping across the water. All he had to do was shut his mouth, but Odysseus could not leave without claiming credit. He stood at the back of the ship and shouted his real name across the waves. Tell them it was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, who blinded you. Big mistake. The Cyclops was Polyphemus, son of Poseidon. Now the god of the sea knew exactly whom to hunt. Odysseus had left Troy with 12 ships and roughly 600 men. By the time he reached home, every ship would be destroyed, every man who sailed with him would be dead, and 20 years would have passed since he last saw his wife and infant son. This is the story of the smartest man in Greece, a man who could outthink almost anyone but could not outrun the wreckage he left behind. Before the monsters and storms, Odysseus was king of Ithaca, a small, rugged island in western Greece. He did not command the largest army or rule the richest kingdom. His greatest weapon was his mind. He was persuasive, deceptive, and brilliant at discovering solutions that stronger men could not see. He married Penelope, and together they had a son named Telemachus. But their peaceful life ended when the Greek kings were called to war against Troy. Later legends say Odysseus pretended to be insane to avoid joining the war. He yoked an ox and a donkey together and began sowing salt across his fields. But a Greek messenger placed the infant Telemachus directly in front of the plow. Odysseus immediately turned aside to save his son, revealing that his madness had been an act. The deception failed. Odysseus sailed for Troy, leaving Penelope with their newborn child and a promise that he would return. The Trojan War lasted 10 years. Still, the walls of Troy would not fall. Finally, Odysseus proposed a plan built not on strength, but deception. The Greeks constructed an enormous wooden horse, hid soldiers inside it, and pretended to sail away. Believing the horse was an offering, the Trojans dragged it through their gates. That night, Odysseus and the hidden soldiers emerged, opened the city gates, and allowed the Greek army to pour inside. Troy burned before sunrise. The Greeks called it victory, but beneath their songs were murdered families, ruined temples, and a civilization destroyed by one brilliant idea. Odysseus had ended the war. Now he wanted only to return to Penelope and the son who no longer knew him. The voyage home should have taken only a few weeks. Instead, disaster came almost immediately. Odysseus and his men landed among the Cicons, allies of Troy. The Greeks raided their city, killed its defenders, took its wealth, and refused to leave when Odysseus ordered them back to the ships. Reinforcements arrived at dawn. 72 Greeks died before the fleet managed to escape. It was the first warning that the survivors of Troy had carried the violence of the war with them. A storm then drove the fleet to the land of the Lotus Eaters. The fruit offered there caused no visible wound. It simply made people forget. Those who ate it forgot their homes, their families, their duties, and even their grief. Several sailors tasted the lotus and no longer wished to leave. Odysseus dragged them back to the ships and tied them down while they begged to remain. He understood that a man could lose his life without dying. He could simply forget who he was, but the mistake that would truly curse the journey was still ahead. The fleet reached the island of the Cyclops. Odysseus entered a large cave with 12 men, expecting to meet its owner. Inside, they found sheep, cheese, milk, and enough food to supply their journey. Odysseus's men wanted to take what they needed and leave, but Odysseus insisted on waiting for the owner. That owner was Polyphemus. The one-eyed giant entered the cave and sealed its entrance with a boulder no human could move. When he discovered the strangers, he seized 2 of Odysseus's men, smashed them against the stone, and ate them. Odysseus could not kill the Cyclops because only Polyphemus was strong enough to move the boulder. They needed him alive if they were ever going to escape. So Odysseus created a plan. He offered Polyphemus powerful wine. The Cyclops drank greedily and asked the stranger for his name. Odysseus answered, "Nobody." Once Polyphemus collapsed in a drunken sleep, Odysseus and his men heated a sharpened wooden stake in the fire. Together, they drove it deep into the giant's single eye. Polyphemus screamed for help. Other Cyclopes gathered outside the cave and asked who was attacking him. "Nobody is killing me," Polyphemus cried. Believing no enemy was there, the others left him alone. At dawn, the blinded Polyphemus moved the boulder and felt the backs of his sheep as they passed through the entrance. But Odysseus had tied his surviving men beneath the animals. One by one, they escaped directly beneath the Cyclops' hands. It was a perfect victory, until Odysseus demanded credit. As the ship sailed away, Odysseus revealed his real name, his father, and his kingdom. Polyphemus raised his hands toward the sky and prayed to Poseidon. He asked that Odysseus return home late, broken, alone, and find suffering waiting inside his own house. Poseidon heard him. From that moment, the sea became Odysseus's enemy. Odysseus and his fleet later reached Aeolus, ruler of the winds. Aeolus welcomed them and gave Odysseus a leather bag containing every dangerous wind. With the storms trapped inside, a gentle wind carried the ships toward Ithaca. For 9 days they sailed perfectly. On the 10th day, Odysseus could finally see the fires burning on the shores of his homeland. Then he fell asleep. His men had spent the entire voyage watching the mysterious bag. They convinced themselves that Odysseus was hiding gold and treasure from them. The moment their captain closed his eyes, they opened it. Every trapped wind exploded into the sky. The ships were torn away from Ithaca and hurled back across the sea. When Odysseus returned to Aeolus and begged for help, the king refused. He believed that a man so hated by the gods was too dangerous to shelter. Odysseus had been close enough to see his home. Now it was gone again. The fleet next entered a narrow harbor belonging to the Laestrygonians, a race of cannibal giants. The giants appeared along the cliffs and attacked from above, hurling enormous boulders onto the ships. Sailors were crushed, speared from the water, and dragged away. 11 ships were trapped inside the harbor and destroyed. Only Odysseus's vessel, which had been anchored outside, escaped. 12 ships had become one, and the worst part of the voyage had not even begun. The survivors reached the island of Circe. She welcomed a scouting party into her home, served them food and wine, and then transformed the men into pigs. Odysseus went after them alone. On the way, the god Hermes gave him a magical herb that would protect him from Circe's spell. When her magic failed, Odysseus drew his sword and forced her to restore his men. Yet the trap slowly became a refuge. Odysseus became Circe's lover, and the crew remained on her island for an entire year. The man who claimed that home was his only desire had stopped moving toward it again. When Odysseus finally prepared to leave, Circe told him that he must first journey to the land of the dead and speak with the prophet Tiresias. At the edge of the world, Odysseus poured blood into a trench and summoned spirits from the darkness. Tiresias warned him that he could still reach Ithaca, but only if his men refused to harm the sacred cattle of Helios, the sun god. If they disobeyed, every one of them would die. But the most painful spirit Odysseus encountered was his own mother. She had survived the war, but during the long years that followed, she had died from grief while waiting for her son to return. Odysseus tried 3 times to embrace her. 3 times. His arms passed through nothing but shadow. The cost of his absence was finally standing before him. Circe had also warned Odysseus about the Sirens, creatures whose song promised sailors everything their hearts desired. Any man who followed their voices would steer his ship into the rocks and die. Odysseus sealed his crew's ears with beeswax, but his curiosity would not allow him to remain deaf. He ordered his sailors to bind him tightly to the mast and ignore every command he gave until the island was behind them. When the Sirens began to sing, Odysseus fought against the ropes. He screamed, pleaded, and ordered his men to release him, but they could not hear him. They continued rowing past the wrecked ships and bones of the men who had obeyed the song. Another impossible choice waited ahead. On one side of a narrow passage was Charybdis, a whirlpool powerful enough to swallow the entire ship. On the other side was Scylla, a monster with 6 heads. Odysseus chose Scylla. He knew exactly what the decision meant, but he did not warn his men. As the ship passed beneath the cliffs, 6 monstrous heads descended and seized 6 sailors from the deck. The men screamed Odysseus' name as they were carried away. He had saved the vessel by deciding which men would die. The remaining crew eventually reached Thrinacia, the island of Helios. Odysseus repeated the warning he had received from Tiresias. Under no circumstances were they to touch the sacred cattle, but storms trapped them on the island for weeks. Their supplies disappeared, and the men began to starve. While Odysseus slept, the desperate sailors slaughtered the cattle. They chose to risk the anger of the gods, rather than slowly die from hunger. When the winds finally changed, the crew returned to sea. Zeus was waiting. A thunderbolt tore the final ship apart. The mast shattered, the hull split open, and every remaining sailor was thrown into the waves. One by one they drowned. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to broken pieces of the ship, as Poseidon's curse reached its conclusion. The sea carried him to Ogygia, the island of the goddess Calypso. She rescued him, loved him, offered him immortality, and kept him there for 7 years. But every day, Odysseus sat on the shore and stared toward a home he could not see. At last, Athena persuaded Zeus to intervene. Calypso was ordered to release him, and Odysseus constructed a raft. Poseidon found him again and shattered it in another storm, but Odysseus survived. He eventually reached the land of the Phaeacians. After hearing everything he had endured and everyone he had lost, their king gave him a ship and promised to carry him home. Odysseus fell asleep aboard the vessel. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the shore of Ithaca. 20 years after leaving, Odysseus was finally home, but his kingdom was no longer the place he remembered. 108 suitors had occupied his palace. They consumed his wealth, pressured Penelope to choose a new husband, and plotted to kill Telemachus before he could claim his father's throne. Penelope had resisted them with her own intelligence. She promised that she would choose a husband after completing a burial shroud for Odysseus's elderly father. Each day she worked on the cloth. Each night she secretly undid everything she had woven. For 3 years, the deception held the suitors back. Athena disguised Odysseus as an old beggar so he could enter his kingdom unnoticed and discover who remained loyal. Near the palace, an ancient dog lifted its head. Argos had been young when Odysseus left for Troy. Now he was neglected, weak, and dying. Yet through Athena's disguise, the dog immediately recognized his master. His tail moved once. Then, having waited 20 years for that moment, Argos died. Odysseus could not openly mourn him. He entered his own palace as a stranger and allowed the suitors to mock him, insult him, and throw food at him while he silently watched and planned. Odysseus eventually revealed himself to Telemachus. The infant he had left behind was now a grown man. Father and son embraced, then immediately began preparing to reclaim their home. Together, they hid the suitors' weapons and waited for Penelope's final challenge. Penelope announced that she would marry the man who could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads, arranged in a line. One by one, the suitors tried. Not a single man could even string the bow. The palace filled with laughter when the old beggar requested a turn. Odysseus lifted the weapon and examined it carefully. Then, with the ease of a musician tightening the string of a familiar instrument, he strung the bow. He raised an arrow, aimed, and fired. The arrow passed cleanly through every axe head. The laughter stopped. Odysseus turned the bow toward the men who had invaded his palace, consumed his wealth, threatened his son, and attempted to take his wife. With Telemachus beside him and the exit sealed, Odysseus revealed his true identity. The hall became a battlefield. By the end, every suitor lay dead. But Penelope did not run into Odysseus's arms. 20 years of lies, rumors, and false hope had taught her to be cautious. She needed proof that this scarred and changed man was truly her husband. Penelope ordered a servant to remove their marriage bed from the chamber and prepare it for the stranger. Odysseus reacted immediately. The bed could not be moved. He had built it himself around the trunk of a living olive tree rooted beneath their bedroom. Moving it would mean cutting the tree from the earth. Only Penelope and the true Odysseus knew that secret. Her test was complete. The king who had crossed the world was recognized not by a victory, a weapon, or a crown, but by the memory of something he had built with his wife before the war. Odysseus had defeated Troy with a lie. He had escaped the Cyclops with a false name. He had resisted the Sirens, entered the land of the dead, and survived the anger of the sea. Yet every act of brilliance had carried a cost, and many of those costs had been paid by others. The Odyssey has survived for almost 3,000 years because it is not simply a story about monsters. It is a story about pride, temptation, loyalty, grief, and the distance between leaving home and becoming worthy of returning. Odysseus spent 10 years winning a war and another 10 trying to come back from it. In the end, the greatest journey was not across the ocean. It was the journey from the man who demanded that the world remember his name to the man who finally understood what that name had cost. He won the war, he lost his way home. 20 years later, he finally found it.